I looked at Susan across the table, the candlelight flickering on her face like the distant glow of a fire. It was our 5th anniversary, a date I had once considered sacred. Josh, our 4-year-old son, was staying with her parents, and I hoped that tonight would bring back what we seemed to be losing. The steak on my plate was still steaming, the knife resting beside it, ready to cut through the meat, or, as it turned out, something much bigger. She set her fork down and looked at me, her eyes, usually as warm as a summer sunset, now cold as glass. "Henry, I want to be honest with you," she said, her voice slicing through the silence like a blade. "I miss new emotions. Other men. An open relationship might help us." I froze. The fork with a piece of steak hung in midair, and my heart plummeted into a void. My brain refused to process her words, clinging to the hope that this was a joke, some kind of cruel prank. But her face remained serious, almost indifferent. You're serious?" I managed, feeling my throat tighten, as if someone had slipped a noose around it. She shrugged, a light, careless motion, as if she were suggesting a different bottle of wine rather than shattering everything we had. "I thought you'd like the idea. Don't all men want multiple women? It's strange that you're reacting this way." Her words hit me like a slap. We had Josh, our little boy who just this morning had laughed while building a tower of blocks. We had years together, memories, nights where we fell asleep in each other's arms. And now, she was suggesting this? Destroying everything for the sake of some new emotions? I flinched, unable to contain the anger bubbling inside me, and accidentally knocked over my wine glass. It toppled onto the table with a dull clatter, the red liquid spilling across the white tablecloth like fresh blood from an open wound. A waiter rushed over to clean up the mess, his movement swift, but his gaze lingered on us, sharp, observant, with a hint of judgment. Our eyes met for a brief second, and for some reason, I felt like he knew more about this situation than we did. "We're a family, Susan," I whispered, searching her face for even a trace of the woman I had loved. She sighed, turning her gaze toward the window, where the city lights flickered beyond the glass. "Forget it," she finally said, her tone softer, as if that could erase her words from my mind. It was just an idea, but I couldn't forget. Her voice, cold and unfamiliar, lodged itself in my head like a splinter. We finished dinner in silence, the clinking of cutlery against plates somehow louder than it should have been. The tension between us hummed like a tightrope ready to snap. On the drive home, she turned on the radio, humming along to some song as if nothing had happened. I gripped the wheel, eyes fixed on the road, and thought, who is she now? The woman I had loved, or a stranger wearing her face? The rose-colored glasses I had been wearing throughout our marriage cracked, and for the first time, I saw the fractures that had perhaps always been there. 3 months had passed since that dinner, but her words wouldn't let me go. They gnawed at me from the inside, like a starving beast, leaving behind only emptiness and unease. I tried to live as before, waking up in the morning, taking Josh to daycare, smiling at Susan when she kissed me before work. But every time I looked at her, I heard that cold voice again. "I miss other men." It echoed in my mind, impossible to escape. I began to notice things I hadn't before. She started staying late at work, blaming it on projects and urgent deadlines. Her phone was always face down now, as if it was hiding something I wasn't meant to see. One evening, I picked up her scarf to hang it on the hook and caught a sharp scent of citrus cologne, foreign, unfamiliar, something I had never worn. The smell hit me like a warning. "Did you change your perfume?" I asked casually the next morning as she packed her bag. She threw me a quick glance over her shoulder and smiled, too fast, too forced. "No. Someone at the office probably overdid it with their cologne. The place always reeks like a perfume warehouse." I nodded, but her answer left a bitter taste in my mouth. She left, the door clicking shut behind her, and I stood in the hallway, gripping the scarf. For some reason, I didn't believe her. That scent wasn't random, it was hers now, a part of some new world she wasn't letting me into. That night, as she slept, I made a decision. It was impulsive, almost shameful, but I couldn't stop myself. I crept into the living room, where her bag rested on a chair, and peeked inside. Among the keys and lipstick was a crumpled receipt from a cafe called Luna. I pulled it out, smoothing it between my fingers. The date, last Friday. The time, 8:47 p.m. A bill for 2. She had said she was with coworkers, but she had never mentioned this place. We never went there. Not once. I shoved the receipt back, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a small thing, but it burned like a hot coal in my mind. The next day, I started paying closer attention. Her phone calls became more frequent. She would step into another room, shutting the door behind her, speaking softly, almost whispering. One evening, I caught a fragment of a conversation. "Yeah, tomorrow at 7, like always." She came back with a smile, but her eyes were empty, like a doll's. "Who was that?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "A coworker." "Work stuff," she replied without looking at me, then disappeared into the kitchen. Her answers were getting shorter, more evasive. I watched her walk away, my mind spinning with questions. What is she hiding? I didn't want to believe the worst, but doubt had already taken root. It grew inside me, twisting around my thoughts like ivy, and I knew that soon I would have to find answers. That night, I lay in the dark, listening to her steady breathing beside me. She slept so peacefully, as if her conscience was clear. And I stared at the ceiling, wondering, if she's lying, how far has it gone? And can I live without knowing the truth? Doubt had become my constant companion. It followed me like a shadow, whispering questions I didn't want to answer. I tried to hold on, for Josh, for whatever was left of our family, but every day with Susan felt like a test of endurance. Her smiles felt like a mask, her words like empty shells, hiding a truth I was too afraid to uncover. One evening, she walked into the kitchen while I sat at the table, staring blankly into my coffee. She stood by the stove, stirring something in a pot, her movements so familiar, so routine, that for a fleeting moment, I almost believed everything was still okay. And then she said it. "Henry, I'm pregnant." Her voice was even, almost mechanical, as if she were reading a grocery list. The mug trembled in my hands, coffee spilling onto the table. I lifted my eyes to hers, feeling the world beneath me tilt. We hadn't planned for another child. After Josh, she had insisted on birth control, saying, "One is enough." I had trusted her. I always trusted her. But now, her calmness, her cold certainty, sent a shiver down my spine. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice hoarse, as if I hadn't spoken in days. "Yes. I took a test. Twice, if that matters to you." She shrugged, stirring the soup as if this conversation was nothing. I stared at her, and only one thought spun in my head, the one I didn't want to say, but couldn't hold back. "Are you sure it's mine?" The words came out sharper than I intended. Her face tensed, eyes narrowing like a cat's before a strike. She slowly turned to face me, gripping the spoon in her hand. "Of course it's yours." "What kind of question is that, Henry?" Her voice carried a flicker of indignation, but it felt rehearsed, like a poorly delivered line from a bad play. "I want a DNA test," I said firmly, locking eyes with her. "Otherwise, I won't believe it." She froze. The spoon clanked against the edge of the pot, and for a split second, I thought she might scream or throw something at me. But instead, she turned away and resumed cooking, as if nothing had happened. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating like fog. I waited for a response, but none came. She simply went to bed after dinner, leaving me alone with my cold coffee and a lump in my throat. The next morning, she acted as if nothing had happened. She kissed Josh on the forehead, smiled at me as she handed me a piece of toast, as if last night's conversation had been a dream. But I noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she poured herself tea. She knew I wouldn't back down, and that either scared her or enraged her. I couldn't tell which. My suspicions grew like weeds. She started leaving the house more often, to the store, to a friend's, but came back empty-handed or with flimsy excuses that sounded more and more fake. One night, she was gone for 3 hours, mumbling something about traffic when she returned. I looked at her, and my mind screamed, "She's lying." That night, I lay beside her, listening to her steady breathing. She slept soundly, while I stared into the darkness, clenching my fists. Her lies were everywhere, in her voice, in her gestures, in her hollow stares. And I knew that soon, I would have to face them head-on. Life with Susan felt like walking on thin ice. Every step threatened to break beneath me, but I was still trying to hold on. Her words about the pregnancy kept replaying in my head like a broken record, and her cold silence after I demanded a DNA test only fueled the fire inside me. I wanted to believe her. I wanted it more than anything, because without that belief, all that remained of our family was an empty shell. One evening, she came home holding an envelope. Josh was already asleep, and the house was quiet except for the ticking clock on the wall. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, pulled out an ultrasound photo, and placed it in front of me. "Here, Henry. This is our baby," she said, and her voice wavered. as if she truly felt something. I picked up the image, staring at the tiny speck on the black and white scan. It was so small, so fragile. For a moment, warmth flickered inside me, the same warmth that had once connected us. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe this really was my child, and all my suspicions were nothing but exhaustion and paranoia. She looked vulnerable, sitting there with her shoulders slightly hunched, and I almost believed her. "Do you really think I could ever?" She started, but trailed off, dropping her gaze to her hands. I didn't answer. In that moment, I wanted to reach for her, to erase the past few months, to go back to what we once had. I almost believed. But the next day, everything fell apart. I was picking up Josh from daycare when I noticed her car parked in front of the house. She was supposed to be at work. Something pushed me to check. I don't know if it was instinct or pure desperation. I opened the passenger door, reached under the seat, and found a crumpled condom wrapper. A brand I didn't recognize. One we had never used. It lay there like a piece of evidence at a crime scene, and my fingers trembled as I held it. I walked into the house with the wrapper burning in my pocket. Susan stood at the stove, humming a tune, her movements light, effortless, like she wasn't carrying a lie beneath her heart. I stared at her, and the rage inside me surged like a rising tide. "What is this?" I asked, tossing the wrapper onto the table. It clattered against the wood, and her humming cut off abruptly. Her face went pale, but she recovered quickly, just like she always did. "I don't know. Maybe one of my friends left it in the car." She shrugged, but her voice trembled just enough for me to catch it. "Really?" My voice rose, my patience snapping. "Do you think I'm an idiot?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned back to the stove, her back straight, but I saw the tension in her shoulders. I walked out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind me, and collapsed onto the couch, gripping my head. Her lies were everywhere now, suffocating, inescapable. And that brief moment of vulnerability with the ultrasound? Nothing but a performance. I sat in the dark, listening to her clatter dishes in the kitchen. She was still playing her role, but I was no longer an audience member. I was the judge, and soon, she would have to answer for everything. My suspicions had turned into an obsession, and I could no longer pretend that everything was fine. Susan continued living her life, smiling at Josh, making dinner, kissing me before heading to work, but every gesture felt staged, like a cheap prop in a play. The condom wrapper, her evasive answers, the scent of another man's cologne, it all painted a picture I was too afraid to see in full. But I couldn't stop myself anymore. One evening, she told me she was meeting with colleagues. I nodded, muttering something about Josh, but as soon as her car disappeared around the corner, I grabbed my keys. It was an impulsive, almost insane decision, but I needed to know. I waited a few minutes, then followed, keeping my distance. She didn't drive toward the city center where she usually met friends. Instead, she headed to the outskirts. The streets became narrower, the streetlights sparser, and soon, I saw the sign, Dark Horse, a small bar with flickering neon letters. She parked by the entrance, adjusted her hair in the rearview mirror, and stepped inside. I pulled over across the street, killing the engine, hiding in the shadows. Through the fogged-up window, I spotted her. She sat at a table against the wall, facing a man. The lighting was dim, making it impossible to see his face, just broad shoulders, dark hair. They laughed together. Her hand rested on his arm. He leaned in, whispering something, and she didn't pull away. Her fingers lingered on his wrist, and that simple, intimate gesture hit me harder than I expected. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My heart pounded in my chest, hammering against my ribs, my temples pulsing with adrenaline. I wanted to storm inside, grab her, demand answers, but I was frozen. An hour passed. Then another. I watched them talk, watched her nod, watched her smile grow wider. Finally, she stood, adjusted the strap of her purse, and walked out, alone. I drove home ahead of her and lay in bed, pretending to be asleep. She returned half an hour later, her footsteps light, almost silent. The mattress dipped under her weight, and I felt the warmth of her body settle beside me. She sighed softly, shifting to get comfortable. Soon, her breathing evened out. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering, how can she sleep so peacefully? The next day, I called Tom. Tom had been my best friend since college, the one person I trusted more than anyone. We met at a cafe, and I laid it all out for him. "She's sneaking around again," I muttered, staring into my coffee. I followed her. I saw her with someone in a bar. Tom frowned, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. Henry, are you sure? Maybe you're overthinking. She said she was meeting colleagues. I'm not paranoid, I snapped, slamming my fist on the table. I know what I saw. He nodded, but something flickered in his eyes, a shadow, subtle, fleeting, but unmistakable. I dismissed the feeling, chalking it up to exhaustion. Back then, I didn't know he was hiding more than I could ever imagine. Susan's belly grew with each passing day, and her pregnancy became an unbearable reminder of my suspicions. I saw her body change, heard her footsteps echoing through the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that none of it belonged to me. Her evasiveness, her lies, the scene at the bar, it all gnawed at me until I decided to put an end to the uncertainty. The DNA test became my last hope, my weapon against her silence. I demanded it again one evening while she sat in the living room flipping through a magazine. I want to know the truth, Susan, I said, standing over her. And you won't talk me out of this. She looked up, her gaze tired, almost irritated. Do whatever you want, Henry, she muttered, crossing her arms. If it makes you feel better. Her indifference only fueled my determination. I collected the samples, hers, mine, Josh's, and sent them to the lab. The week of waiting stretched endlessly. I barely slept, lying awake at night staring at the ceiling, picturing the worst. What if the baby isn't mine? What if everything I thought I knew about her was a lie? The envelope arrived on a Saturday. I grabbed it from the doorstep while Josh played in his room and Susan was in the kitchen. My hands trembled as I tore it open. The words on the page struck me like a fist to the chest. Probability of paternity, 0%. The baby wasn't mine. I read the line 3 times, hoping for a mistake, but numbers didn't lie. Storming into the living room, I found her still seated, the magazine in her hands. The paper slapped against the table in front of her, making her flinch as she looked up. Who is he? My voice shook with fury, rasping at the edges. She paled, her fingers clenching the magazine so tightly the pages crumpled. She said nothing. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Who, Susan? I roared, slamming my fist against the table. Then, the doorbell rang. I yanked it open, expecting a neighbor, a delivery, any excuse to break away from this nightmare. But it was Tom, my best friend from college. He stood there, holding a bottle of wine, his usual easy smile on his face, like this was just another casual visit. Hey, man, thought I'd drop by. He started, then hesitated when he saw my face. And in that instant, something clicked. His calls to her, the ones I barely noticed. His coincidental run-ins with us lately. His words at the cafe, convincing me I was paranoid. It all came together, forming a picture so clear and so sickening I thought I might be sick. You. I whispered, my voice raw with disbelief. He opened his mouth, but I slammed the door in his face before he could speak. I turned back to Susan. She understood. Her eyes widened, and the magazine slipped from her fingers, landing on the floor. Henry, she started, rising to her feet. I raised a hand, cutting her off. Don't. My voice was quiet but final. It's over. She sank back onto the couch, her face as pale as chalk. I walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the truth she could no longer deny. My world had collapsed. But now, at least, I knew who I was fighting against. Tom was her lover. That thought spun in my head like a scratched record, poisoning every breath I took. My best friend, the one I shared beers with in college, the one I confided in over coffee just a week ago, was the same man who had driven a knife into my back. I replayed every conversation from the past months, how he listened, nodded, poured me whiskey, assuring me I was imagining things. All while he was sleeping with my wife. I sat in the living room, gripping the DNA test results. The paper was crumpled from my clenched fists, but I couldn't let it go. Susan had stormed into the bedroom after my outburst, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. Her silence was louder than any words. She knew the mask had been torn off, and she didn't even try to pick it back up. The next day, I called my lawyer. Josh was at daycare, and the house felt as empty as my soul. I want a divorce, I said, gripping the phone until my knuckles turned white. And I don't want her to get a damn thing. The house, Josh, everything stays with me. His voice was calm, professional. That won't be easy, considering her pregnancy. But if you can prove infidelity, the court will likely favor you. I have a DNA test, I replied, and a witness. But I wasn't done. Revenge became my fuel, bitter, burning. I called her parents. Her mother sobbed, repeating, how could she, over and over. Her father stayed silent before finally hanging up. I texted our friends, her coworkers, everyone who knew her. The messages were short, brutal. Susan cheated on me with my best friend. The baby isn't mine. By evening, social media was buzzing with whispers and speculation. Some wrote, "Poor Henry." Others, "What a disgusting woman." I wanted her to feel what I felt: humiliation, isolation, emptiness. To watch her world collapse the way mine had. She tried to defend herself. One night, I came home to find her standing by the door, gripping a packed bag. Her eyes were red, but her voice wasn't shaking from sadness, it was anger. "Henry, this isn't what you think," she started, stepping toward me. "Tom was a mistake. Just once, I swear. I love you." "Love?" I let out a sharp, bitter laugh, stepping back. "You love me while sleeping with him? While carrying his child?" She fell silent, her arms dropping to her sides. "Get out," I said, opening the door wider. "And don't come back." She stood there for another moment, like she wanted to say something, but then she turned and walked away. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving behind nothing but silence. I leaned against the wall, feeling my rage slowly drain into something else. Something colder. Tom vanished, too. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he skipped town right after I slammed the door in his face. Maybe he abandoned her once he knew I had the truth. Maybe guilt finally caught up with him. I didn't care. He was dead to me, just like she was. That night, I lay in bed alone, staring into the darkness. The revenge had started, but I wasn't finished yet. She would pay for every glance, every lie. The divorce went through faster than I expected. My lawyer was a master of his craft. He took the DNA test results, the evidence of her affair, and turned them into unshakable arguments. The judge, an older man with weary eyes, looked at Susan with cold judgment as I laid the documents on the table. The house stayed with me and Josh. There were no alimony payments. She walked out of the courtroom, gripping her purse, never looking back. But it wasn't enough. I wanted her to fall as far as I had fallen during those sleepless nights, sifting through her lies. My revenge didn't stop with the legal system. The messages I sent to her friends and coworkers spread like wildfire. Social media buzzed. Susan cheated with her husband's best friend. She's pregnant, but not with Henry's child. Her reputation collapsed in days. I heard the whispers at her workplace until, eventually, she quit. The friends she used to drink wine with on Fridays stopped returning her calls. Some pitied her. How could he leave her pregnant? They wrote in comments, but their voices were drowned out by condemnation. Most simply walked away, leaving her to fend for herself. One day, I saw her by accident at the supermarket. I was pushing a cart with Josh, picking out cereal when I spotted her at the checkout. She stood there with a basket filled with cheap canned food and pasta, gripping a handful of coupons. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, dark circles pooled under her eyes, and her coat hung on her like it belonged to someone else. She saw me. For a brief second, our eyes met. Her face wavered, something flickering in her expression before she turned away, mumbling something to the cashier. I felt no triumph. Only a strange, hollow sensation, not pity, but something close to emptiness. She looked nothing like the woman who had sat across from me at that restaurant, coldly suggesting an open relationship. I had destroyed her, but it didn't bring me peace. Tom was gone for good. Some said he left town, abandoning his job and apartment. Maybe he couldn't handle the shame. Maybe he left her, too, when he realized I knew everything. I didn't care. He had ceased to exist for me the moment I saw him standing at my door, smiling with that damn bottle of wine. Josh asked about her. One evening, he sat at the table, coloring with his crayons, and then looked up. "When is Mommy coming back?" His voice was small, uncertain. I froze, choosing my words carefully. "You'll see her soon," I finally said, running a hand through his hair. "She just lives somewhere else now." He nodded, returning to his drawing. But I saw it, the tiny crack in his world, mirroring the fracture in mine. I didn't lie, she could see him, but she could never return to our home. Her time here was over. That night, I lay in bed, staring into the darkness. Her life had crumbled like a house of cards. And yet, I still didn't feel relief. Only exhaustion, and the echo of everything we had lost. I sat in the living room, staring at the table in front of me. Upstairs, Josh was asleep, his steady breathing drifting through the slightly open door, soft, rhythmic, the only thing still anchoring me to this house. On the table lay my wedding ring, dull and cold in the lamplight. It was the last shard of who we had been, the final remnant of what I had lost and what I had destroyed myself. A year had passed since the divorce, but time had done nothing to heal the wounds. I thought revenge would bring me peace, that by tearing Susan's life apart, I would regain control of my own. But instead, all I was left with was emptiness, heavier than rage, sharper than grief. I turned the ring between my fingers, feeling the scratches etched into the metal, the marks of 5 years, erased by her betrayal and my fury. She had moved on. I knew this from Josh, who came back from her place with stories about his baby sister and mommy's new apartment. He didn't understand the weight of it all, but I could tell his questions about her were becoming less frequent. Susan hadn't begged me to return. She hadn't crumbled. When I picked up Josh from her place, she stood in the doorway, straight-backed, silent, holding her daughter in her arms. Her eyes were empty, but not regretful. Maybe she blamed me. Maybe she thought I had gone too far in burning her world to the ground. I set the ring down on the table and leaned back against the couch. It sat there like a punctuation mark at the end of our story. I thought about that night in the restaurant, the shattered wine glass, her cold voice, the strange look in the waiter's eyes. Back then, I had thought it was the end of the world. But that had only been the first step off the cliff. I had found the truth, Tom, the DNA test, her lies, and I had responded in the only way I knew how, destruction. The house was mine, Josh was mine, her reputation had turned to dust. But what had I won? I turned off the lamp, and the room was swallowed by darkness. The silence was suffocating, no footsteps, no voice, just my thoughts circling around everything we had both lost. She was alone now, left with a child from a man who had run. And I was here, with the son I loved but couldn't shield from the pain, with a ring that meant nothing anymore. I closed my eyes, and the memory of our last meeting surfaced. She had stood in the doorway of her apartment, handing Josh over to me. Her fingers trembled slightly as she passed me his backpack. She wasn't wearing her ring. She had taken it off before I had. She hadn't said a word, but her silence had been louder than a scream. We had both lost. She had lost her family. I had lost myself. The ring remained on the table, cold and unmoving. I didn't pick it up again. In the darkness, I realized this wasn't just the end of her fall. It was the end of mine, too. And neither of us would ever find our way back.